Welcome back to part 2 of our series on how to manage those difficult conversations. I'm Dr. Jackie Cawley, your host for today's session from the Delean Institute for Growth and Wellness. We are so excited to have you join us today. So let's get started. When we talked last time, we talked a bit about just effective communication in general, went over the 4 C's of effective communication, right? Remembering to be collaborative and to be compassionate, to make sure that you're really concentrating and focused on the conversation, etc. Now, the other thing that we talked about was that these are difficult conversations for a reason, right? They're high stakes, important to you for some reason, some conflict that needs to be worked through, some messaging that has to be given to the other individual. And so there's just some important basics that you have to consider too, and we talked about that as well last time. Today, we're going to go into the 4 phases of how to prepare, plan, and hold those conversations. So in this section, we'll do the first 2 phases. I'm going to go ahead and share my screens. All right, how to manage through those difficult conversations. I'm going to pull up the next slide, and when you see this one, you'll see a great quote by Benjamin Franklin. Now, by failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail, right? By not making sure that you've got a good plan in place to hold the conversation, actually doing the work before the work, then you're planning to or preparing to fail, as Ben says. So let's talk a little bit about what do we mean when we're talking about the first phase. And with the first phase, I call this the 3 Ps. And the 3 Ps for a reason, because it's around planning, preparation, and then practice. And the practice is really important. So when we plan the conversation, it's really about considering who is this conversation with? Why is this conversation needing to happen? And you can't put it off, right? Because that's one of the concepts that we talked about, that timeliness is really important. So if you need to have this conversation, it's important for you to understand who it needs to be with, why you need to have this conversation, and what's your goal for the conversation, right? I mean, why do you want to have it? And how do you even know if it's going to be a successful conversation if you don't understand the goal? The other thing that you need to really plan for is when and where. When we talked last time, we talked about how space is important, right? The space and the place. We need to make sure that we are honoring the other person, having the conversation in a more private environment that is not pulling out any hierarchy or authority by having them come to your office or something along those lines. You want it to be in a space that is a little bit more objective, in a cafe, in a quiet corner, in a conference room where there's windows so that there's light and opportunity for people to walk by, but not to hear your conversation. And also to think about when. Timeliness is important, so don't put these conversations off. The next thing we want to do is to prepare, right? So when we prepare, it's actually writing out not just your goal for the conversation, but also what are some of those key talking points? What are some of the key things that you need to make sure the other person is hearing from you? And then you need to respond and be ready for different scenarios that might come up. So there's a whole different way of possible ways that people could respond to what you have to bring up. So for example, if you need to have a conversation about your 30-year-old moving out, then there may be a number of different responses that they have. They might get angry, they might start crying, they might say, well, yeah, I agree. Maybe this is the best thing for me, and how should we go about it? So there's possibilities, right? Same way as if you need to talk to an employee who may be coming to the office late on a regular basis or just not as productive as you need them to be. They allow a lot of interruptions, or they're interrupting others during the day. So you need to be able to think about, what do I need to say to that individual about how their behavior impacts myself, the rest of the team, the organization, our outcomes, etc. And what is it, the behavior? What kind of behaviors do I need to see from them instead? What are those possible responses? They could get angry with you. They could stomp out. They might possibly just start crying and say, I'm sorry, I didn't realize this was impacting the team. It's because I'm getting late to childcare, or I have a problem with childcare, or perhaps it's that their transportation to work has been jeopardized in some way. But you don't know what's happening with this other individual until you get into the conversation. So you need to think about, what are the different scenarios that could play out during your conversation? How would you respond back? And remember, when we talked last time, that active listening is really important. So it's not about trying to respond in your head while they're even just talking to you initially in response to what you had to say to them. It's really being open and listening to them so that you can gauge, how do you move the conversation forward? Remember, your job is to not let your emotions lead. You want to lead through this conversation with this other individual. So think again about preparing your key points, possible responses that they may have. Whole number of scenarios could happen, and how would you respond back? Which brings us then to the third P, practice. Practice with a friend or even in a mirror. It helps to build self-confidence, and it will reduce any of your anxiety. That's right. By practicing and making sure that you're ready for those possible scenarios, either through some role play with a friend, or just talking in the mirror, or just kind of going through it in your mind as you're driving to work, or even, standing in the grocery line. It builds your self-confidence, it reduces your anxiety, and it makes you feel much more ready for that conversation. We'll move on to the second phase, which is phase 2. Now, just as I said before, it's really important to make sure that you do not put these conversations off. Those emotions only fester, and it gets harder. That's right. It gets harder to manage and harder to have. So don't put it out. You need to schedule and commit. Commit to that difficult conversation. Commit to having that heartfelt, compassionate, and caring and respectful discussion with the other person to get your needs met. So again, sooner is better. Space and place matter, as we talked about before. Now, you want to make sure that it's quiet enough and private enough, but also safe, and safe for you in case you needed to stop the conversation for whatever reason. Remember, there's different scenarios that can happen, and people do sometimes get angry. And you also want to make sure that it's safe for the other individual as well. And so setting up a space that is inviting and doesn't put you across the table, but perhaps next to the person so that you can be facing them, have good eye contact, all of that is really important. So make it safe and think about the space. Give it time. Don't rush these conversations. Again, you don't know how things are going to play out. So you want to make sure that you're really taking the time to have the conversation and allow those different scenarios to play out, allow emotions to be validated and not leading, but present with you so that you can manage through them and stay the course. You have this. You are going to do great with this. And by preparing you, just more ready for the conversation, right? You've thought about it. You worked through it. You thought about the scenarios. You planned for it. And by planning, you are not going to fail. You're going to manage through it successfully and do a great job. When we come back next time, we'll talk about the next 2 phases in the process. And those are really around actually having the conversation. Lots of tips and tricks around that to help you manage through successfully. And then finally, and very importantly, the follow-up and next steps after the conversation. Because unfortunately, it's not always one conversation. Sometimes it's a series of conversations. I hope you enjoyed this part in our series, and we'll look back soon to have you join us for session 3. Have a great day.